SFT, what's up, man?
Brother Tony, good to see you, my man. Good to see you.
Yeah, nobody's taking on our Abiogenesis video challenge, huh?
No, we've got a series of interviews over the last couple months with a number of PhD chemists, and we've got an Abiogenesis challenge out there for people to answer all the chicken and egg problems with RNA world, metabolism first, all the different, stories that are being pushed, and nobody's taken the challenge. Not even Dodgeball Dan, Tony. Not even he's willing to take the challenge, and he's an evolutionary biologist.
Right. Well, they don't have anything other than it happened somewhere on another planet that we just, can't show today, but it still happened.
Can I do?
Well, here's my thought. I'd like to point out that there's one thing that was said a long time ago that I'd like to comment on. It's that claim. I think it was James who said it, but I can't quite remember. It's been a crazy after show and a crazy debate. But apparently, we are the ones as biblical creationists that reject science or biological science, I think it was, when I truly believe it is quite the opposite. I mean, we're literally accumulating way more mutations generation after generation than selection could ever remove or filter out. But my point is, man is clearly degenerating, okay? And yet we are to believe that pond scum evolved into people through processes that are either one, fine-tuning, or two, destructive, like mutations. How is this science? So my point is, it appears to me that it's the naturalistic evolutionists like Amy and James here who are the ones who deny science. I mean, like James, for example, since you're the one who made the claim, would you ever say that man currently is getting better, improving biologically?
I don't think that's the claim that evolution makes. It doesn't. There's no objective better. It's just suited for your environment. So it's not a, is man better or not? It's, are we suited for the environment that we're in? That's all evolution really cares about. It doesn't care about what's better or, it's just about fitness for survival.
Yep. It just happens to be we're the species that's adapted very well.
Well, here's the thing, though.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to point out the fact that we understand biological evolution. We understand the mechanisms behind it. But here's the thing. The more we learn, and the fact that all population geneticists would admit that man is presently degenerating, and the evidence would seem to suggest that we are degenerating from a point of perfection. And that's why my question was that these mutations that the theory of evolution would say are the driving force behind taking a fish to fisherman. Now, I understand all the typical talking points, like you said. There's no direction. Evolution can explain up, down, right, left kind of thing. But here's the empirical facts. Here's what we see today. We see that generation after generation, we are accumulating more mutations that are deleterious than selection could ever remove. Take that back to a point in time of least mutation accumulation. You are now at a point of perfection. Okay, a perfect genome, perfect creation. So it is the naturalistic evolutionists that are saying that pond scum evolved into people over billions and billions of years of incremental changes, mutation accumulation. How is that empirical? Let's look at the empirical evidence. How can natural selection, acting upon random variation, these mutations, of course, how can that take pond scum to people? How is that science? And I don't want to hear talking points or just textbook answers on how biological evolution works. I understand all that. Address the actual data, because apparently we're the ones that reject science. So that's kind of my question that I would have for any of the evolutionists on the panel. Go ahead.
Well, do you realize that the vast majority of biological scientists affirm the theory of evolution? Is that not?
Well, that's an argument from consensus and majority. So once again, okay, we transmit here. I'm going to teach some basic science. So we transmit
I'm just
a small.
Asking if that's what you accept.
Actually, there are a huge number of PhD scientists, many of which I have interviewed. You can check my channel. I've got a playlist of about 15 of them that reject evolution. And even your evolutionary scientists, like your population geneticists, they will admit, like Kondrashov, they will admit that man is presently degenerating But they are still holding to the bigger picture of Ponce come to people evolution. Therefore, they are coming up with stories and rescue devices on how to explain away the data, right? They're not going to question the bigger picture. So I admit that those biased scientists, they have a position that they have to hold to. My question to you is, though, and I understand what their rescue devices are regarding mutation accumulation, but how would you guys, using your own critical thinking skills and avoiding arguments from majority, how do you explain the removal of all of these mutations that are deleterious pouring into the genetics of humans? How do you explain that according to your model?
The Gibbon has entered the room, and she's far more qualified to talk about that.
She's the most qualified.
I would just say that I don't think the data supports intelligent design. I would say that you are also really biased because you really, really like the idea of there being a God, and you really like the idea that he poofed everything into existence. So you're going to be biased toward that conclusion. Any data that you see, you're going to try to make fit that paradigm. And, we all have our biases, and the scientific method is designed to try to weed those out and get us to be more objective. But that's it's how you look.
Okay, well, let me just
standing. Hang on. Before we go down that rabbit hole, Erika, welcome to the after show.
Hey.
I know you were watching the debate as well, so we're going to rewind, everybody. We're going to rewind back to the beginning of the after show. Erika has now joined us, so she gets to insert her opinion about the debate, who she thought won, lost, best points, best comebacks, and then we'll return back in any other. And feel free to insert anything else you want into the conversation. Then we'll go back.
Absolutely.
First when you moved your hand like that, I was thinking, these are the streams you're looking for.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is my volume level fine?
Yep, you're coming through great. Okay, everybody shut up. It's Erika's turn to talk.
Yeah. I'm super glad to be here. It's been a while since I've managed to actually make one of these after shows. I'm sorry if I'm talking a bit quiet and it took me a while to get in. My fiance's brother is in town, and so I had to sneak into the room where I keep all my stuff to go snatch my mic and my computer charger. But yeah, I really enjoyed the debate. I really did. I thought that things stayed typically things can get pretty heated with those kinds of conversations, but I thought that it stayed pretty civil, all things considered. And I've heard Amy and John and Smokey debate before, but I'd never heard anything from James W before, so I thought that was kind of neat as well. I think the only issue really that I had was I felt like there were times when the two teams were almost discussing different things. There was a little bit of talking past each other where the direction was almost a bit aimless. And I think that Chris is an awesome moderator. I think she did a great job. And everybody has different moderation styles. I don't know that I would have done anything different if I were in her position, but I think that maybe a more active moderator than either of us two would have been able to say something along the lines of, let's make sure we're on the same page, discussing the same direction, and things of that nature. But yeah, I genuinely thought everyone did a good job. As for who won, the thing about those kinds of debates is I don't really think you can say who genuinely did win or lose and be objective. I think it's very difficult to say the very least. All I can say really is that I enjoyed everyone's performances, I guess you would say, for a debate, and I found the side chat very stimulating. So, and I'm glad to be here and talking about it.
Well, I appreciate that, Erika, and I'll insert a different opinion question for you.
Sure.
So, debate aside, in the after show, do you think there has been at least an attempt to have good back and forth dialogue from both parties?
I gotta say, John, this is probably one of my favorite after shows I've seen you host. I really do. I think that the panel is going really well. I think that everything's stayed really civil and that people genuinely, for the most part, are trying to understand where the other side is coming from. And I think that that's like the very first stumbling block that any kind of debate or argument has is, are we genuinely trying to understand, even if we're dead set against agreeing and think that the other party's basis is just as far from reasonable as possible. The very least we can do is try to understand the perspective of the other person that we're having a conversation with. And I think everyone here has really done a good job at doing that from what I've seen. I've been a little bit in and out, but that's my opinion.
Well, I appreciate that. Now, before this degenerates into SFT versus Erika round 75, I think that Sunflower had something he wanted to insert, and then Standing, we'll go back to you because you were talking.
Yeah.
Sunflower, is something you wanted to say?
Okay. Yeah. I guess it's not off topic, but I guess it's something that hasn't been brought up yet, and that's that like. So when I think about like, let's say when discoveries were made, like Göbekli Tepe, or even cave paintings, or even certain things that kind of when they're discovered, it's like, oh, this radically changes our model of anthropology, and how did they have this before that, and how did they have religion before agriculture, and things like this. When you see things like this, it seems to me like we have a lower standard of human civilization or intelligent design, because it's like, oh yeah, well, of course Göbekli Tepe was just humans building a worship temple, or of course the cave drawings were humans sort of drawing what they lived with. But then when we go back to Abiogenesis, it's kind of like, for some, what I don't really find is consistent is like, well, we have to make the parts fit so that it wasn't intelligent. It's like, why can't we look at cave drawings and say that this was random? This was sticks smacking against the wall, or why? Like it's like everything else is just accepted as like, oh wow, this is now new information that humans lived here and intelligent people took part in these things. But then when we go back to the big enchilada of how something arose without intelligence, it's kind of like, let's try to make the parts fit together as best as we can, so that it doesn't invoke an intelligent designer. And I feel like that's a little bit, I just don't really see why, because the intelligent designer doesn't even have to be a god or a supernatural force in that case. You could just say, oh, it sort of seems like maybe a intelligent alien life form, or some sort of primitive but yet intelligent ancient life form on Earth kind of like had something to do with this. We don't know if that's true, but it's definitely a possibility. It doesn't seem like that's ever really considered. It always just seems like we must formulate the best hypothesis of how this happened with zero intelligence. And that's why I when I juxtapose that against Göbekli Tepe, cave drawing, things that are like possibly human, or maybe likely human, why are we having?
Hey, Sunflower, you're getting really muffled, man.
I'm sorry, what was that?
You went like you got really muffled there for a second.
Oh crap! What was it? Should I reiterate my last point?
It was just like the last sentence.
So, yeah, I think we got the good gist of it for sure. But if you want to summarize it, by all means.
Okay, really quickly. So it's like this: the standard we apply to evidence of human, or at least intelligent, like sophisticated human design or interaction, in terms of things like cave drawings, Göbekli Tepe, or other things, seems just far lower than the standard we apply for origin of life, in which it's almost like we not only have to reject a possibility of intelligence, even if it's naturalistic, we have to figure out how this happened without intelligence. So that's the gist of my point.
Yeah, they're failing anyway.
Okay, yeah, I want to respect the rules of the after show. How do we decide who? I know Standing wanted to speak for a minute, John. So do I need to wait my turn?
Standing, are you back to mainlining coffee, or are you still ready to talk?
I've got my
Erika,
coffee in hand.
Okay, so Standing,
Go ahead.
I wanted to go too, John.
Before Erika makes a point, do you mind if I can? Because I think she can then add to it or say it better. But then I'll secede myself.
Okay. Amy, hang on. Amy, go ahead. Then Tony can make a quick interjection, and then we'll go back to Erika, and then Standing. So go
Totally.
ahead,
Perfect.
You're a good moderator, John.
Yeah, you've been awesome. And I think, like I said, I want to hear Erika's thoughts on this. You were asking about pond scum to people. And to me, because I'm highly fascinated in that specific subject and going through all the stages. And to me, the real linchpin between what got us between these simple celled organisms and the multi-celled is this symbiotic event that happened with mitochondria. As soon as this symbiotic event happened, where mitochondria became these energy sources, all sorts of interesting multi-celled organisms began sprouting up. And it does seem with that, and then to piggyback on that, photosynthesis, so almost like a third symbiotic relationship, that's why we have all these crazy organisms. I don't know if Erika is, but that's my pond scum to people.
Oh, God.
Okay. Tony, go ahead. Okay, Tony, go ahead and make your point, and then Erika can go ahead and respond to Amy. Go ahead, Tony.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, Erika, me and SFT, we've been chatting in the chat for, I guess, years now. I don't know. We've never crossed paths. I've been trying to get a debate with your leader, Aaron Ra, for about 10 years, and he keeps dodging me. But we got a couple Abiogenesis videos that we'd like you to, I don't know, make a rebuttal video, address some of these problems with the RNA world and metabolism first and protocells, which have all been plagued with problems. And we get no response. So SFT can go a little further on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you guys both post some interesting ideas. I think Sunflower's point should be absolutely commended, because the idea is essentially this: it feels like there's this double standard, right? We look at things that are clearly made by humans or hominids, or at least intelligent, what we consider to be intelligent human-like organisms of the close to modern day, and we feel very comfortable looking at those and saying this was done by a hand, this was done by an organism, something with opposable thumbs that thought, hey, maybe I'll draw an antelope today on this cave painting, or the likes of Göbekli Tepe, or many of our sort of early Paleolithic sites. But I think that the primary difference that these kind of issues between what feels like a double standard between abiogenesis and the likes of early hominins is what evidence is there to support something versus what evidence is there to preclude something. So in the case of cave paintings, right, humans make cave paintings today. Humans have made cave paintings almost throughout our entire history, from recorded to what looks like even prior to that. And of course, the way that we know this is because, well, we see them doing it today, and we've never seen anything else do it. Now, that isn't to say that you can definitively say one way or another that every cave painting was made by a human. I could look at the likes of humans making cave paintings today and find an organism that isn't a human, like, for instance, what happened with Neanderthals and Homo erectus and other hominins, and say, well, this thing has a pretty big brain case. And it also has hands that look like it can manipulate tools, and perhaps maybe it did the same things. And all of a sudden that broadens this area of consideration from humans are the only things that cave paint to maybe other things do too. In the case of abiogenesis, we don't see anything else making life in the modern day. We don't see any abiogenesis or genesis events from intelligent beings or otherwise. We can't even do it ourselves.
We're trying.
We are engineering. Hold it. We are engineering RNA in the laboratory through highly manipulated, controlled processes that would never occur on the early Earth. In fact, PhD Fuzz Rana made that exact point to Aaron Ra, and his answer was, I don't know. I don't study origin of life.
Yeah, so the thing is that I don't either, and that's typically why I don't debate abio very often. But that being said, there's some, again, this is kind of why I made the distinction early on in sort of my monologue here. There's a huge difference between a lack of evidence for something in its entirety and evidence that exists to the contrary. Now, in the case of intelligent design, I would argue that we don't have evidence for or against it. But the problem is, in the event that you have a hypothesis, right? I'm struggling to think of an example kind of off the top of my head. But let's say I wander into the woods and I find I don't know, a teepee or something along those lines, a structure that's clearly been made by something. Well, I could posit that perhaps the Boy Scout troop down the river made it during their annual troop meeting, and then maybe I find out, well, actually they didn't have a meeting that week, or they weren't in the area, or something along those lines. And then someone else comes along and says, well, that's really interesting. My neighbor camps in the area, and he's really into like the YouTube videos where you make like old timey structures out in the middle of the woods, like the where that the guy makes the pool out of like mudstone and stuff like that. It looks really awesome. What am I looking at? What am I thinking of? You guys know the videos I'm talking about? The dude
Yes,
that
I've seen those. Yep.
yeah. I forget what they're called. There's like a specific channel that does quite well. He'd do very well for himself in like a post-apocalypse. But the difference between those two hypotheses is in the second one, right? Both are viable. You don't have evidence to prove that the Boy Scouts did it. Maybe I don't know about it, but they had an emergency troop meeting, but I don't have that information at hand. Both could potentially be viable, but one has more evidence than the other. One has more support than the other currently does. And so in the case of science, that would be the one that we would consider. And in the case of abiogenesis versus intelligent design, that's kind of how I see it. I don't think that you could say that intelligent design is off the table necessarily. But that being said, I think that while we don't have the entire thing figured out, we have relatively large chunks of it figured out. And this is the important part, this is the big one, there is no evidence to preclude it. That's the biggie.
Okay, but Erika, are you aware? Are you aware that chemists, when they run their experiments, they don't start from scratch? They have to filter molecules and purify things to get the desired structures that they want.
Tony, I'm sorry. I think Erika gave a really, really great response to my question. If I may could I just maybe respond?
Go ahead, Sunflower, and then Standing, you're up next, buddy.
So I agree absolutely with what Erika just said, at least insofar as we can't necessarily preclude abiogenesis. However, it raised an interesting question in my mind, and that is that now that we are intelligent beings and we're trying to create life ourselves, whether or not it's through an attempt to demonstrate that it could have happened originally, or whether or not it's just like people trying to kind of play God and create like synthetic life and so on and so forth. So it's like we know we're trying to do this to various extents in the scientific field. I feel like I see that as kind of a way to strengthen the argument when you say, well, we make cave paintings today. It's kind of like, well, we also attempt to spawn life from non-life today. This was the the Miller-Urey experiment. I mean, as we move forward, all of our experiments that are attempts to any experiment we make that attempts to prove it could have happened in an abiogenesis early Earth is being done by us as intelligent beings, and thus doesn't that kind of imply that like the origin of life as we know it here was a previous intelligent being trying to do experiments about how to prove that they could create it's like we're all of our experiments to prove that early Earth abiogenesis is possible are being done by us.
Yeah, with intelligence.
But what I'm just saying is that, like, couldn't it be possible that
it's the very thing they're trying to remove from the scenario is an intelligent agent, but the very thing needed to generate genetic information is an intelligent agent. That's how stubborn and delusional they are, the atheist community.
Wait, Tony, hold on. I'm also agreeing with Erika in that it's not impossible that it could have happened. It could not have been naturalistic abiogenesis in the first place. But as time moves forward, doesn't it become increasingly likely that all future iterations of life were then the result of like let's say there was there was the initial abiogenesis, and then from that you got a bunch of intelligent human-like creatures that tried to prove it via experiment, and this happens for like billions of years, and like at a certain point every iteration of life is just the result of a previous intelligent species trying to prove that it was possible. I know that's crazy, and I know it sounds a little bit just tinfoil hat. But
No, I like it. I think it's an interesting point. I would love to respond to it, but I want to give Standing his go too. So I'll pass that on to him. But I would love to. Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting idea. I'd love to give my thoughts.
It's too late. My coffee's done. I'm tired. I'm going to bed. No, I'm just kidding. Good to see everybody.
Yeah,
Good.
so Standing usually is mainlining coffee until 4 to 5 a.m. I don't want to hear any. I don't want to hear any excuses. Go ahead, man.
Even coffee at 2 a.m. for me, John, is too late. Yeah, good points from everybody. Erika, good to see you here. Great moderating the other day in the debate with me and good old Walker. You're always nonpartisan and neutral, so good job. Yeah, so let me see here. I guess based on what we were discussing earlier, Amy, so I guess the question would be regarding what she was talking about would be, can the endosymbiosis theory explain the origin of eukaryotic cells? Actually, before I continue, is my audio okay? I was hearing some feedback. I'm not okay.
You're coming through fine.
So from my understanding on that theory, it has many problems and it's not very empirical. I think it's actually been dealt with in the 70s and 80s. I know there's numerous problems with it. But I would say that the major problem is the fact that given what we know today about mutation accumulation, there are obvious shelf lives on genomes, like we were discussing earlier. So the question I had was, what type of selection can filter out so many new mutations, right, that are both slightly deleterious and unselectable? What's fascinating is the fact that numerical simulations have actually confirmed that even with purifying selection and other realistic parameters, the genetic degeneration of the human species is inevitable. And some of those papers, they are in the mainstream journals. And the only rebuttals you'll find to them have come from blogs or YouTubers, which obviously isn't very convincing. So the numerical simulations, the data regarding genetic degeneration still stands. It's empirical. So I do think I made my point with James. I was simply just pointing out the fact that it is not us as biblical Christians or creationists that reject science. It is the naturalistic evolutionists that reject empirical science. So given James's response, it seems like he's just choosing to simply trust the consensus, which to me, as an answer, is a logical fallacy and just blind faith in those that actually, what's interesting, in the blind faith in those that acknowledge the problems with mutations and selection, taking a fish to fishermen, but simply what they're doing, when you read their papers, they're invoking rescue devices and a number of hypotheses to explain away the data. So they're acknowledging it, and now they're trying to come up with solutions, right? When in fact, to us, as biblical creationists, the data is very nicely consistent with our model of a once perfect creation that has what? Has degenerated to where we are now. I think it's fascinating that you can take this point of most accumulating mutational damage to a point of least genetic degeneration, which would be a point of perfection, a point of creation. So I think our model and our position is very empirical, very consistent with the scientific data, and can lead to retrodictions and predictions. So that would conclude what we were discussing earlier, I think, before we got onto a couple new topics. So I'm good with that. I'm good with that.
And can I ask Gutsick Gibbon or Erika, what would be your answer to, I hate that word, pond scum to people, but what would be your explanation for how going from like multi-celled to how we are, or single-celled to how we are now?
I mean, that's a great question. Again, you're asking someone who looks at the very, very tail end of, like, in depth, so to speak, at the very, very tail end of the evolutionary history of humans. And even then, I don't even focus on humans. I focus on extant primates in general. So it would include humans, but typically because humans are narcissistic, we like to give our own ology. So we get anthropology and everybody else gets primatology. But yeah, so with regard to that, now, again, there was a period of time when I was much more brushed up on my abio stuff. It was actually earlier this year. But I really dug as deep as I could into it. And I got about probably about 3/4 through John Maddox's, through John, actually, your lovely paper compilation, which has been a beast to get through. It's a lot of papers. It really is. I commend you for collecting them all, because there really is a lot to get through. And my general thoughts on the matter, it really boils down to this. The likelihood of life coming from non-life, that is to say, organic life coming from an inorganic soup of chemicals, when you look at the bare numbers of it, it's unlikely. I mean, obviously, that's putting it mildly. We don't see it happening today for a completely different reason. I mean, today it's impossible for new life to emerge simply because everything else is already just absolutely perfectly selected to their niche, and because of that, there isn't any room for anything that isn't ideal for its environment to come into being. But that being said, it starts with, and this is my opinion, again, recalling what kind of I studied several months ago, but chemicals, inorganic chemicals in and of themselves, to a degree, self-organize. And we see this in chemical reactions every time a reaction occurs. They go from a more unstable organization to a more stable one. Now, there have been some really interesting physics papers put out by the likes of England et al., who essentially said, okay, well, if it is in the best interest for things to go from at least on a small scale, a state of relative disorder to a state of order, which the idea behind that in chemistry is that in the long term, it ends up increasing entropy. So in the short term, it looks like you're getting more order, but in the long term, you actually end up getting more disorder. There's a lot of weird physics that goes into that, and I only took undergrad physics 1 and 2, so I'm really not the person to talk about that either. But that being, I mean, I could talk about hominids all day, of course, or primates, but that being said, there have been some really interesting papers put out by physicists like England et al., who have said, okay, well, interestingly enough, the formation, the structure of RNA and DNA actually are one of the best organic mechanisms of creating more entropy, so to speak, creating, more heat release overall, et cetera, et cetera. And I can link, I don't have a wrench, but I can put them in the side chat in StreamYard. And I've provided them a few times in some of my video content as well. But the idea is that the second that you can get a single time the formation of the basis of RNA, or even metabolism first, which would then yield RNA, is the moment that you start to see a heavy, incredible selection for that entity or organism to reproduce. So the question becomes, okay, well, how do you get that in the first place? And the answer to that is a very complicated one that we have not solved. I will be the first one to say it. Abiogenesis is not a solved issue, but I liken it back to the entire idea of there isn't anything that precludes abiogenesis. And initially, from square one, we were like, well, we don't have any of it figured out. Well, now we've figured out that lipids self-organize next to hydrothermal vents. We can see this in real time right now. We can see that there are many different natural substrates that self-organize RNA from its bare minimum bases. And we can see that the likes of some amino acids can be found naturally in, crazily enough, meteorites. Now, I don't personally subscribe to panspermia or anything like that. It's just an interesting side note that you can get all of these components together at the same time in a prebiotic Earth. So now the question becomes, okay, well, just because you can put all the pieces of a plane together, it's the classic tornado in a junkyard. You can put them all together in one place. How do they self-organize? And that's, of course, an entirely different issue. And that's the part that we're having a lot of trouble figuring out, not the least of which because we don't know with any 100% certainty what the prebiotic conditions of Earth are. Now, it's shifting a lot less than it used to because thanks to geochemistry, we're able to hone in on it a lot more and figure out within a better margin of error what it was probably like. But that's going to take still quite a bit of work. I think, though, that we've got a decent starting place on that. And I think that the biggest factor on the side of abiogenesis is time. And I've said this before, Kent Hovind hates this. And he's like, oh, yes, of course. Well, you give them enough time and they'll, it all works. It all comes down to time. Time is their God. And in a way, you're kind of right. But I have yet to meet a creationist, a young earth creationist, who can grapple with the reality of the ancient timescale. That to me is the linchpin argument of where I'm coming from as someone who is into the idea, who leans heavily towards abiogenesis, but certainly is very into the theory of evolution.
Okay, so Erika, let me interject here real quick.
No, I'm done anyways.
And
Thank
I
you
know,
for your monologue.
oh, of course. And I think Standing wants to get involved in this too. And I know Sal, when he gets back, wants to hop in here.
I wanted to respond to Standing at some point too.
Sorry, who was that? Sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
James.
James, okay.
That's James.
Okay,
I just want to say
let
Nicholas
other
has a fabulous beard. I just want to point that out.
It's quite epic, isn't it?
Oh,
I
thank
am
you.
jealous.
And
Nicholas.
I'd
I
like
am
to
jealous.
hang
John,
on, everybody time out for a second. So
maybe we should go time rebuttals now since everybody wants to talk.
Yeah. Okay. So Amy, I've been literally stroking my beard for like 4 hours straight now. And Nicholas pops on camera for like 30 seconds.
Funny.
And you're like,
you have
his beard is amazing. I'm so insulted. Right? I'm so
Your beard's pretty cool too, John.
You have a sexy beard too.
I'm messing around. Okay,
All
so
beards.
I'll insert later. Standing, go ahead.
Well, I know, John, you wanted to say something there. You can go first if you'd like. I don't want to.
I'll need a long-winded diatribe. Go ahead, man.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
Mine's really quick.
Nicholas, sorry, we just don't really care what you have to say. So here, I'll go first. Nicholas, I'm just kidding. You're just here for the beard, Nicholas. So go ahead.
Now that I'm on camera, am I allowed to talk?
Okay, Nicholas, go ahead, man. And then Standing.
Pull the shirt down where it shows. No, the thing that I don't see any scientific indication of is this concept that chemicals can possibly self-complexify into what do they call it? Into specified systems of manufacturing and computation. So I don't know of any science that indicates that that's possible. I only know of scientific testing and observation that indicates that that is impossible. And the time frame does not matter to that.
Agree. Nick, I think you just muted yourself.
I think he was done.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry, I thought you muted yourself. Okay. Great points, Nick. And yes, I will have a diatribe about that too. Standing, go ahead, buddy. You're up.
Sure. Okay. So I guess now onto the abiogenesis issue, since we just kind of covered the genetic degeneration and the nature of empirical science. Well, when it comes to abiogenesis, here's the problem, is the fact that there are insurmountable problems associated with chemical evolution. Chicken and egg problem after chicken and egg problem after chicken and egg problem, no matter what scenario you're looking at, RNA world, metabolism first, you name it. One that comes to mind in terms of chicken and egg problems has to do with enzymes. And actually, one thing Erika said had to do with like RNA and DNA. The thing is, RNA and DNA both have major problems in any origin of life situations. And I see a lot of, I'm not saying specifically from Erika, but I've just seen a lot of storytelling and a lot of hypotheses that really just go untested when it comes to abiogenesis. Now, here's the problem. RNA is actually more unstable than DNA. DNA is unstable, but RNA is even more unstable. And in our cells, we have what? We have about 1 million DNA breaks every single day. And most of these turn out to be fixed by these amazingly designed repair systems that are in the cell. And I always point out the fact that what we see in the cell is evidence of forward thinking, which necessitates a forward thinker. So, but here's the thing. If RNA, is less stable than DNA, and DNA, right, this goes back to the chicken and egg problem with the enzymes, DNA requires many amazing DNA repair systems, as I just talked about. And this is required for survival over time, okay? So how on earth can, if we're looking at the RNA world, how can this RNA world be plausible? Because let's look at the building blocks of RNA. They're threefold. You got a sugar, a base, and a phosphate. And naturally, these things don't bind to form nucleotide bases that are actually needed for RNA. So right from the start, you've got a major issue even trying to get the building blocks for RNA, because the building blocks themselves are incredibly unstable. This is why these hypotheses, they go untested and unverified. Now, here's an even bigger problem, this chicken and egg issue. Enzymes are now needed as a what? Well, they're needed as a catalyst in the cell. Okay, RNA, yes, can do this in a very, very limited extent. That's important, very limited extent. The reality, when we look at the reality, it's the fact that in living cells, protein-based enzymes do most of the work. So here's the question. How did life change from RNA enzymes, from which there are only limited support for, to these amazing protein enzymes? You know, when did this occur? So here's the problem, is we've got real chicken and egg problems on every single level, because information in the DNA requires enzymes to read it. But then those instructions to build the enzymes are on the DNA, which cannot be read without the enzymes. Dr. Sarfati explained this in our interview with him, and he's a PhD chemist, and he goes over all these chicken and egg problems, right? What came first, the enzymes or the DNA? One thing Erika said was that with lots of time, right, we can't comprehend this massive amount of time for chemical evolution can now supposedly be more realistic with lots of time, when in fact, more time makes chemical evolution even less plausible. There's more problems given more time, because real chemistry goes in the opposite direction than is required by the origin of life, which says life came from non-living chemicals. When it comes to water, if you're trying to explain the origin of life in some fancy pond, well, water tends to drive the reaction in the wrong direction. And primordial soups have lots of water in them, which means water destroys the bonds faster than they can form. So the whole point is, yeah, you can have just so stories, maybe this, maybe that. But the fact is they're going untested. And oftentimes, like Erika was talking about, how lipids apparently can self-organize. John, I know I've been going on for a while, so maybe John can touch on that. But here's the thing. Oftentimes what you see from these little observations is an extrapolation fallacy, right? Maybe this small little observation can take non-life to life. So it's fallacy after fallacy. I mean, there's no plausible explanation for any origin of life scenario. And I think the naturalistic evolutionist just has to face that fact. John, if you wanted to say a few things, I know I went on for a while, but yeah, that's all I got to say.
Before I jump into all that, James, I think you had something you wanted to insert into the conversation, didn't you?
Yeah, just pretty briefly. So, like I said, I'm not an expert about the hyper-technical aspects of abiogenesis and evolution. I'm not a biologist, and I do defer to people who know a lot more than me, a lot more than I'll ever know about that topic. And I'm pretty satisfied that the side of the evolution and the side of naturalism has the greater weight of the evidence. And but I'm certainly open and willing to look at any new evidence that comes up. But that's where I stand on that right now. So
I could, John, if I could say one, because I think that was directed at me. So I'll just say, based on everything we've discussed over the last 45 minutes or so, you saying that the side of evolution and the side of naturalism has the greater amount of evidence, I think it's absolutely clear that it's quite to the contrary, that the evidence is opposite of what is required for that pond scum to people evolution.
I mean, there's so many observations other than the hyper-technical ways of this enzyme or that codon. Like for instance, when you look at the past, all the animals look, most of the animals look vastly different than they do today. You don't find modern species when you look at really old rock. Species change over time. That's evident in the fossil record. Exactly how that happened, we can debate it, but to just say that no, God did it all 6,000 years ago is not, a very convincing hypothesis.
Yeah, the experts don't have anything for the origin of life. It's been failing for decades.
Well, would you agree that we are alive? It had to happen somehow, right?
That's not an answer. Yeah, we're
Well,
here by design. You wouldn't agree
we
with
are
that.
here, but you haven't been able to show any evidence of this design. It's just an
Plenty.
argument from incredulity that you don't
No, plenty.
understand.
Are you
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 don't
aware of RNA
understand.
engineering?
Okay. Hang on.
Are you aware of RNA engineering and how it works in the lab with intelligent agency only?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Hang on.
Now,
guys.
then you don't know
So,
what you're talking about.
hang on.
All I'm saying is you're saying an argument you don't understand how it happened. Therefore,
No, I'm saying we are
the
showing
God
it.
hypothesis is
James,
plausible.
hang on. I'm gonna let Sal jump in on this one.
Yeah.
Before we turn it over to Sal, James, that argument that you're making is literally requires a suspension of rationality based on knowledge which we have. And the entire point that's being made, which I'm sure Sal will expound upon in great detail here in a second when we turn it over to him, is we are not arguing from incredulity. We are arguing from what is known to be required in order to get molecules to do things which are not natural if you don't have all of these ridiculous amount of control mechanisms already in place, which is the entire point.
Exactly.
Anyway, I'm going to shut up now.
Hey,
John, because
Hang on, everybody, no. It's Sal's turn. Go ahead, Sal.
well, wait a minute. James just made that comment to me, so I should be able to let me have a 10-second final response because James was responding to me. So my response to that would be the fact that historical reconstructions are only as good as what? The observations and the empirical data that we are discussing here. So like I said, we see shelf lives on genomes. We see genetic changes down, and the fossil record that James here is now pointing to, which is kind of a red herring in a debate, can be very deceiving. It's very indirect and low quality. The direct evidence is what? In chemistry and genetics. That's what we are discussing here, and the chemistry and the genetics points to James and his historical reconstructions being false. That's all I got to say.
Hey, John, can I have 10 seconds really fast too, just to say one thing, and then I swear I'll shut up.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the reason why this is occurring in labs in man-made conditions with highly sterilized environments that are fine-tuned is because there isn't anywhere in nature today that you would be able to observe abiogenesis happening for the reasons which I stated earlier. Nothing can come into existence when a niche is already occupied. That's why we don't see new abiogenesis events occurring. Okay, sorry, leading.
Right, but
We actually set up prebiotic conditions that fail every time, Erika. We are able to simulate early Earth conditions, and they never work.
Right, I'd love to respond to that, but it's Sal's turn, sorry.
Okay, all right. Everybody be quiet. Sal, go ahead, man.
Oh, thank you. Argument from contradiction is not an argument from incredulity. If I said, if someone said they believe a tornado passing through a junkyard will build a 747, I'd say that doesn't make sense. That's not an argument from incredulity. That's an argument from contradiction from what we know of how things, physical objects behave. Engineering designs transcend physics, and I'll explain what that means. But I'd like to point out Richard Smalley, who was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. He's considered the father of modern nanotechnology. He was converted by James Tour and Hugh Ross. James Tour said, origin of life research is retarded. And he was able to persuade Richard Smalley of that same view. So these aren't trivial chemists that are thinking this whole thing is a farce. Yes, they are in the minority, but the truth is origin life research has not progressed. It's gotten worse. They're having more problems to face now than they ever did. I've heard a lot of talk about the RNA and DNA world. There is a serious problem with membranes that spontaneously form, which Erika referenced. There's a serious problem if we don't have transmembrane proteins. It's a great way to make a coffin that's sealed. It's a good way to kill the organism and ensure it never evolves. So without transmembrane proteins, it's going to die. And James Tour called out Jack Shostak for saying that because it's misleading to suggest that just because we can get lipid bilayers to spontaneously form, that life can emerge. It's a really good way to kill life. So this is an example of some of like the self-delusion that's going on in the origin of life world. Same for Jeremy England, who said if you shine a light at something long enough, it's gonna turn into a plant, or something as equally ridiculous. The way that intelligent design from human to human intelligent design is conveyed is to use materials with many possible configurations, or we might call it Shannon entropy. I could take an exercise where I take coins and I'll just tell students, just arrange them in a way that'll convey intelligent design. Well, we could do that all the way down to the molecular level, where we can build structures that are engineered that will go against natural tendencies. The materials that life is made of, the four major components, the macromolecules, the nucleic acids, the proteins, the lipids, and the carbohydrates, those are exactly the sort of things that have very high Shannon entropy. There are many ways you could put it together. That's why in a random soup, it's like a tornado passing a junkyard. The tendency is not to self-organize, but to disorganize. And some of the machines that we could talk about are like transmembrane proteins that are multimeric. You need to have several copies just to work. And how can that happen unless you have a genome in a translation system? There's so many parts that have to be there. And so this whole thing of just saying, oh, we got some prebiotic things to spontaneously form in the lab. This is like taking a picture of Humpty Dumpty falling down off the wall and about to break his head open and say, oh, we have progress to show he's going to survive just by taking a still photo of that egg flying. That's the state of origin of life research. I've talked to biochemists. I said, I would just show extant proteins that exist now in biology. And I'll say, if you didn't know how the sequence is written, could you from scratch build a protein this sophisticated? And some of the proteins I could list are the ones that I studied, like topoisomerase, but there are so many other proteins. I said, could you build an ATP synthase machine from scratch? Do you have the technology? Could you pool the best scientists and build this from scratch? They'll say no, because the protein problem is too difficult. So when they say there's no intelligent design, if you have technology that far exceeds all the sum total of all the best scientists and engineers on the planet, and you cannot exceed it, just not intelligently designed, I have a problem with that, because we can take coins, just random coins, and arrange them to make them all heads. That's trivial. We cannot build life, even if we had blueprints for everything. And that problem was very highlighted when Craig Ventnor tried to create synthetic life. And when he falsely claimed he invented life, he did not. He had to use templates that existed because he didn't have the technology to do it from scratch. So to say that that's not intelligently designed, it's like, okay, well, if it isn't, it's certainly better and more intelligently designed in terms of the technology than all the sum total that we have on the planet.
Can I go next, John, or am I in line?
Randolph, you've been quiet for a while. Do you have anything you want to insert, or Sunflower? And then Erika will come to you if they don't want to.
Totally.
Nothing at this point other than hello to Leophilius in the chat.
Right on. Sunflower,
I'd like to go, John, later. If I can later.
Sunflower, anything you want to add?
I don't know if there's anything I was going to add.
Okay, just let me know if you want to jump back in for anything.
Yeah. Not right now. I'll defer.
Tony, do you have a quick insertion, or do you want some time?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Sal. We can give chemists everything they want and they still can't do it. And some of the things that they have been shown require lots of pre-existing stuff and templates and things that aren't available in just a random mixture of chemicals. So yes, can we do this in the lab? Absolutely. Could it ever happen out in nature anywhere? No, not even close.
Well, we can't do it in the lab.
So it's even worse.
We can't put together cells. We can't put together cells from scratch. Craig Ventnor did it from scratch. And then I forgot to mention, Steve Benner pointed out the asphalt paradox, the water paradox, the single biopolymer paradox. He published this in an Origin of Life journal. It's a peer-reviewed journal. And so this idea that things will spontaneously self-organize, that's refuted by, he said, even, everything we know, all the experiments, all the structure theory, chemistry, this is not where it's going to go.
And Shostak has to start.
Is the normal state. That's where naturalism ends.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be now, but if I can respond to Sal.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to Erika in just a second. Before we do, In line with what you were just saying there, and this is Erika. This is a quick response to one of the things you talked about earlier.
Yeah, no problem.
So the whole organization, replication, and such, like with RNA, they think only things they've been able to get to self-replicate are artificially constructed strands. And as of this year, it is well admitted in the origin of life research community that even when they artificially create something that has the ability to replicate, it always shrinks. It does not, it degrades. It does not, like the literal sequence gets shorter. It does not get longer. So even if there is modification to it, it's a reductionist. It reduces the amount of information that's present. It does not increase. So even if you somehow manage to get to that point, you don't end up with a positive increase. You always, and it's accepted. I watched a whole lecture on this from researchers from the Chemical Evolution Institute in Atlanta from last month. They were talking about this whole problem. And then when you get into the catalytic ribozymes, they are in a 3D fold and they can't replicate. They can cause something, they can catalyze something, but they can't self-replicate themselves.
No,
so
because it's always
you have a ultimate conundrum of anyway, I'm gonna shut up now. Go ahead, and the floor is yours. And then I think Amy, did you say you had something you wanted to add?
Well, I've got the quickest analogy too.
Okay, quick analogy, and then Erika, and then we'll go to Amy. Go ahead.
Okay, so some of these things where they get like a couple proteins to form and stuff, it's sort of like finding a way to get silver or gold, something that's a good conductor, to like become a strand in a natural way, and then saying that a computer and an entire factory run by computers could evolve naturally because you got that little strand to form in some kind of semi-natural way.
Very true.
And the molecules they produce are always homochiral. They're not in the desired structure needed for life. So they have to run all these chemicals through purification processes using designed equipment. It's always interference by the intelligent chemist. Every single time. I can guarantee it.
That's very true. Okay, Erika, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Oh yeah. So there's definitely a lot to cover there. I mean, a lot of you guys have said some really interesting things, and I think that they're fair criticisms. I don't agree with any of them, and I'm going to explain kind of in as best I can kind of why I don't agree with them. So the first one I want to talk about is that you can give chemists anything, as much money as you want, the best equipment in the world today, and they can't make life in a lab. No, they can't do it. There are a ton of different things, aspects of our world that we cannot create as humans, but nature creates and maintains every single day. A really, really simple, idea of this would be we can design ecosystems that work, self-contained ecosystems that work within a zoo, so that animals feel more at home. You see this in most zoos, but we could not create from scratch, even if given all the money in the world. We couldn't replicate the ecosystem that you see in the simple forest that's been retaken over after a volcanic eruption. I mean, we see this occur: primary succession, secondary succession, new ecosystem builds up from the ground. And these are just continuations of existing processes of filling up niches and organisms doing their thing, and seizing new resources. So, to say that because we can't create something currently with all the money and all the best equipment in the world is to undermine not just what we see in nature, but also the entirety of scientific progress. Go back 20 years and you'll find just an uncountable number of things that we couldn't do that we do today all the time, even though they had the best equipment. So I think that that's a little bit of a bad argument to use, that just because we can't do it now means that it's impossible. When I say that there is nothing that precludes abiogenesis, and I heard nothing that anybody here in this recent kind of round of responses that precludes it. I heard a bunch of things, Sal mentioned several different paradoxes, and I was looking them up in the background as I could. And when they're, while they're colloquially called paradoxes, all they are is currently unanswered questions. They're not, this mechanism prevents something from occurring. Now, I want to say something as well about the tornado in the junkyard, because I think that's a good analysis or a good analogy to use, even though it gets kind of dumped on a lot. But we've been working on origin of life research for a decent amount of time, and we've been, increasing exponentially, so our progress goes. But the period of time that the Earth was kind of sitting here with chemicals and doing things and volcanic processes and hydrothermal vents stewing and stirring, and that we know they were doing this for quite a long period of time because of the geochemistry, which I've yet to meet a creationist who can kind of disrupt the geology that tells us that the Earth is indeed very ancient and has been doing this for quite some time. But they were working with billions, if not trillions, more time, I guess you would say, than what we've been working on origin of life research. Now, it's not just that. It's not just one tornado in one junkyard for billions of years. It's trillions upon trillions of tornadoes and trillions upon trillions of junkyards, if the hydrothermal vents are anything to go off of. I mean, we're talking so many trials you couldn't observe them with the best technology in the world all simultaneously.
Erika, time is the enemy of abiogenesis.
Oh, it's absolutely just not, though, Tony. I'm telling you,
Yeah.
it's really not. I heard Standing say that as well about the chemistry being that it degrades or
absolutely, and everything is breaking down, and all your amino acids are turning racemic. We have a great video on it.
Listen, though, Tony, I hear what you're saying, but I also heard you mention the chirality problem, which is kind of an older creationist talking point. The chirality problem is not a legitimate problem. The chirality problem has been dealt with for quite some time. No, I'm serious. This is in the literature. The chirality problem. Now, abiogenesis has problems for sure. Chirality is not one of them. So, and I'm telling you this, like, this is just factually the case.
No one's produced a protein, and no one's produced all left-handed amino acids under prebiotic conditions.
No, not in a lab. No one's produced a lot of things in the lab. That doesn't mean.
So where did it happen? In some imaginary fantasy land in another universe, right?
No, Tony. But the fact that
Erika, hang on. Okay, you don't. Number one, I really don't care about whether it's billions of years or not, because number one, in the context of reality, you don't have billions from your worldview. You don't have billions of years to work with. You have no more than, from your own timeline, you've got no more than 500 million and as few as 200 million to work with, correct?
It very much depends on whose work you're using, but I feel comfortable saying that, yes.
Okay, so you don't have billions of years to work with.
Yeah, it was my mistake, John. It was a slip of the tongue. What I was meaning
but my point is it's a very significant factor in the context of whether or not abiogenesis is plausible. So per what is observed from your timeline, not mine, from yours, you got like 200 to 500 million years to work with. Okay.
May I make a two-word assertion there? I'm not trying to make the case that abiogenesis happened or is even plausible. I'm trying to make the case that it is possible.
Right, but earlier tonight you admitted that from a probability perspective, it is very, very, very unlikely. However, now you're trying to claim that, oh, well, there's trillions of different instances going on, so it actually is something that can be considered plausible.
No, I didn't say plausible. I'm merely saying that it goes from being impossible, because you're not impossible, statistically very, very unlikely, to being much more statistically possible within our observation.
What is the total number of seconds per your worldview? What's the total number of seconds that have existed from the Big Bang until now?
I literally couldn't tell you that, even if you gave me.
Okay, it's 10 to the 15th. The recognized probability for a functional protein to exist is 10 to the 80, 10 to the 7, 1 in 10 to the 77th.
Right, you're assuming a single trial, though. You're assuming a single trial every second. It wouldn't.
No. Okay, there's literally not enough time. Even if you have all these instances happening at the same time.
Wait, no,
Erika, hang on.
That was incorrect.
Erika,
that was just an incorrect statement.
Erika, there haven't been enough particle actions in the entire history of the universe in order to account for the improbabilities that we're talking about. And you don't even have the total number of actions that are possible in terms of now in order for, from your worldview, life to exist.
I want you to clarify something for me, because what you just said was that given the total number of seconds and the given probability, by the way, I've seen that probability, that's a probability given by creationists. It's 10 to the 40th for secular science when you've actually boiled that down. So it's about half of what you gave.
So are you suggesting that the professor emeritus of chemistry, SoCal, biochemistry, I believe it is, who literally wrote the review on that aspect of probable functional protein formation, who literally stated that he found no flaw in the math?
Well, what I'm stating is that the
answer the question. Are you debunking him publicly?
Well, John, it's more complicated than that.
How so? If somebody who is somebody who is an expert and is not a creationist, actually is an atheist, admits that
John,
the math is correct,
I'm trying.
How are you trying to circumvent and claim that I'm making a false assertion?
John, I'm trying to do that. I literally keep trying to explain it, but you want a one-word answer. It's not a one-word answer.
Well, go ahead with your dodge, and then Sal can go ahead. I know he wants to get
it's literally just the fact of the matter. The number that's been given by creationists, at least since I've been looking at all of this stuff, which maybe 2 to 3 years, at least in a serious fashion, is that the probability of life forming from non-life is 10 to the 83rd as given by creationists. Now, when you actually get down and dirty where they get that number from, and I've got this and I see Sal shaking his head. I mean, you can correct me when, if you think I'm wrong, but, I very much would be interested to see why it is that you're saying that. But I'd have to dig through my sources here, because I've got, a decent amount of them. But when you actually dig into that 10 to the 83rd number, it's somewhat of a fallacious reasoning when you actually get down to the brass tacks of where they're getting their numbers from. And this isn't something that's wholly uncommon to see, at least from the creationist literature that I regularly consume. As Sal mentioned earlier, some of the creationist literature leaves a lot to be desired. But I'm not sure the specific professor that you're talking about, but it seems to me that it would be a viable reasoning from my part that you said 10 to the 80th. I've heard 10 to the 83rd.
I was talking about an individual. Okay, 77th, I was talking about an individual protein. And so why, if the probability that we're talking about is so just inferior from a creationist perspective, why does Eugene Koonin rely on the multiverse to be able to have any remotely plausible explanation for abiogenesis and probability?
I've heard Koonin's coverage, and I don't, as an individual, hold Koonin's reasoning of that to particularly high regard. Some people may, I don't. Okay. I think Koonin is unfounded in that assessment.
Okay, so Sal, go ahead and respond to this, because I know you've interacted with the instance in question. Go ahead, man, if you want to respond to this.
The 10 to the 83rd power only deals with the beta-lactamase protein. There are proteins that are way more complicated. The beta-lactamase proteins are only about 400 residues. Something like topoisomerase is probably going to be a lot more difficult. Same for helicases. They are far more essential to life, so the number could be understated. Not to mention, you probably a working cell would need something on that order of having at least those proteins, not to mention transmembrane proteins. So that probability number understates it. Eugene Koonin's figure was just dealing with RNA replicases, not even a full cell. And the number that he came up with was 10 to the 1 in 10 to the 1018th. So these aren't just, the abiogenesis proponents want to try to project this and say these are creationist numbers. These are not just creationist numbers. There's a reason that the multiverse is starting to be invoked, and that there's some sympathy for it. So if we also talk about Seth Lloyd's universal probability bound, it's 500 bits. So what that means is if you had 500 fair coins, and you tried to flip them so that they're all heads, it would take more flips than there are not just atoms in the universe, but even all possible quantum interactions. So even something very small, you don't need something that is especially complex to be highly improbable that you would rule it out from practical standpoint in the observable universe. That's why Koonin is, as John pointed out, is appealing to these multiverses. So I just wanted to say, how do I say this without giving something away? let's just suffice to say it's in the works to revise the numbers that Axe did for the beta lactamases, because that's a very primitive protein, and there's no reason to expect a primitive protein to evolve into another complex one like topoisomerase or helicase. And as I pointed out in Standing for Truth last week, evolutionists are finally admitting there's no universal common ancestry between proteins. There's a reason one protein can't evolve to another. So to invoke the probability of even some trivial protein evolving into something complex, that doesn't even agree with the phylogenetic analysis that even evolutionists accept. So even if we somehow cross the barrier of 10 to the 40th power for one protein, it doesn't imply that they're going to resolve proteins that are as complex or protein complexes like ATP synthase or homohexameric helicase. I'm sorry I'm having to throw out all these terms, but these are real problems.
May I ask you briefly, Sal, what sort?
Proteins. And I've actually been analyzing the interfaces with topoisomerase alone. There are 50 connection points. It's just
Sal, may I ask very briefly what source you're using for the non-universal common ancestry of proteins? Because I've been looking up kind of what you're saying, and so I can drum up my thoughts on the matter. And I want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting you.
Okay, Sal, before you address,
It'd be news to biologists too.
Hang on. So before you respond, Sunflower is getting ready to bounce out. I think he wanted to say bye to everybody. Sunflower, go ahead, and then we'll go back to Sal.
Okay, yeah. Just saying goodbye, but also wanted to just kind of reiterate, I know I'm not simping, but I have a girlfriend, but Erika, I really is one of the most composed and just like rational and like not emotionally driven people that we have had the pleasure to sort of talk to and debate with.
Sunflower, that's very kind.
I just feel that way. Like, I as my Twitter bio says, impeccable intuition and divine wit. So I would like to say this has been extremely productive. John, you've done a great job moderating, and really, I of all the people that of all the atheists create abiogenesis, I really do feel like Erika is one of the most informed and unbiased people. So I really appreciate having them back and forth. But that I also extend that to I think everyone in this chat, but also, and I love the conversation tonight. And with that, I'm gonna head out. But
supremely kind again. Thank you, Sunflower.
Appreciate it.
Well, I gotta say one thing. Erika,
Don't be going
have a good night,
fast. We got
Standing, hang on. I know
for you in
you're
private
freaking
chat.
out over there. Okay,
No, I was just gonna say, Erika, how much did you pay Sunflower to say all of those kind things?
No. What just happened was Sunflower heard that she is in the same building with her fiance and wanted to let him know that if he doesn't treat her right, she's got a fallback position to go to.
No. And now we're putting one and one together.
That's what actually happened. Okay.
Oh man.
You're getting Sunflower in
I'm
trouble.
just impressed because I see so many people in that corner that are kind of like emotional and try to be kind of pithy and whatever. Anyway, great conversation. I'm gonna head out. I'm gonna keep listening, but I'm gonna not be talking anymore. So good chat, guys, and
appreciate you,
Sunflower.
Fun so far. Thank you for being here.
God bless.
Thanks for the input.
All right, now I got to.
Sunflower, do glance at private
we got to
chat
get
before you're
back
gone.
into mod
Love
mode.
you
Okay,
all.
so later, Sunflower. Okay, so Sal, go ahead and respond to Erika on the protein question, and then I believe Amy wants to hop in next, and then we'll go to SFT.
Yes. Thank you for asking, Erika. I provided 2 references in the chat. One to Honig and Petrie. It had some problems in the reference section, but it explains part of the problem, and it links to a paper by Wolf and Kunin, which I also described the title. It was Genomics of Bacteria and Archaea for the emerging dynamic view of the prokaryotic world. It points out that there's not a universal tree of life, at least that they can't reconstruct it. They're arguing for a web of life, whether that means we're just unable to reconstruct it from extant data, or whether there is no single universal common ancestor, that can be certainly debated. I will point out your colleagues, like Speed of Sound, said, "Oh, and Immutable Destiny agree that not all proteins or genes, protein/genes, descended from a single common ancestral gene." So you can, I'll defer to your colleagues on that, because they seem to agree with me that not all genes, proteins could possibly descend from the same common ancestor. And one of the reasons for that would be, whether one's a creationist or an evolutionist, is that there has to be several simultaneous proteins in existence just to make the cell function, and they're radically different. So I just throw that on the table. So thank you very much for your interest in that. I would be interested.
No. I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right thing.
All right. Well, I appreciate y'all's back and forth on that. I'm sure we'll get back into it.
I'm sorry, just briefly. The reason I'd be interested for Erika's viewpoint is that would falsify common ancestry of all genes and proteins. That's a good start.
It's a well-accepted theory within science. They're not really challenging common ancestry, but you're welcome to.
So, Amy, did you listen to a word that Sal was just talking about?
Yeah.
Literally talking about how it's being challenged.
I know what he said. I don't believe that's the problem.
And he put links to papers. So again,
link them. I want to see them.
They're already in the chat, I believe. Is that correct, Sal? Did you already put links? Okay. Yes, he did. Okay.
And so can I ask my actual question? So Sal,
hang on, Amy. Before you ask your question,
okay.
I'm done with your snide little BS. If you're not going to pay attention to what people say, and then you're going to claim that what they just said is false, and you didn't listen to him talk about how he published links to papers, which is the whole point of what the question Erika was asking him. I mean, you got to pay attention. Go ahead.
I think that's an unfair assessment. I think that's
you literally just embodied what I just said. Now go ahead.
Okay, I disagree. Anyway, so Sal, you seem very educated, and you seem to have a high bar for abiogenesis. I want to know if you have a high bar for your God. Do you have some sort of mechanism by which this God creates life? Do you think that it will one day be replicatable, or is there anyone working on how God creates life?
I can only express my own personal beliefs for what they are worth, and I don't think we will ever know the mechanism.
That's a low bar. We're starting really low. Like, what happened to this whole bar? You were all talking all this genetics and stuff.
Okay, Amy, I'm done.
No.
Nick, you have something you want to say, bro?
I want to hear.
I'll explain the reason why. Is that it would involve laws. It would involve principles that are not according to accepted chemistry and physics, both the ones that are accepted and also possibly in the future. The reason for that, and it was published in Travers and Abel's paper, Chance and Necessity Do Not Necessitate the Origin of Life. It was in Cell Biology International. They pointed out that the design of life transcends physical laws and chemistry. If you're in another universe with different physical laws, you would still have the same problem, because Turing machines are not based, they're not the inevitable result of the laws of physics. It actually has to, there's an aspect of Turing machines or any self-replicating von Neumann automata that as a matter of principle has to be independent of the laws of physics. That's a principle that I think a lot of people don't realize. If you have a self-replicating automaton, a quantum computer, anything, or a Turing complete machine, it has to have an aspect that is highly improbable as a matter of principle. It doesn't matter what the law of physics is. So when you ask for mechanisms that cannot be resolved to any mechanism that can be expressed in algorithmically compressible laws like our accepted laws of physics, that is kind of very high-end computer science, but it's a discussion worth exploring. And I'm happy to put the paper written by Travers and Abel. Abel is probably an ID proponent. Trevor's, his co-author, is an atheist, but I felt he had enough intellectual honesty to talk about the problem of origin of life, and he said we probably will not be able to resolve the mechanism. It's what they call in mathematics a formally undecidable problem.
And I would like to mention this has come around full circle back to the intro that LPP and Smokey gave at the debate.
Well, 3.5 hours in is usually where that starts. Standing, you still there, man? You want to hop in? I know you've been waiting for a while patiently.
Yeah, no problem. No, this has been fun. This has been a great after show. Definitely, probably one of the best. So, Erika, thanks for joining as well. You've made it that much more fun. So I'll be quick, I guess, in my response, given that I have said a lot, and I believe that which I have pointed out goes unchallenged. Now, I'm not saying, just in this discussion, I'm saying in general. There's no real empirical answer for the numerous overwhelming problems for chemical and even biological evolution. I think in the nicest way possible, Erika proved my point that what we're looking at here is a lot of just so stories. Because here's the thing. There has been no solution to all of these large numbers of chicken and egg problems, one of which I went into incredible detail on with enzymes, for example. Look at all the different scenarios. You got metabolism first. Look at RNA world hypothesis. No matter what even the supposed origins from space, all of these have numerous unsolvable problems. And Erika once again appealed to time, when in fact I think Tony correctly pointed out that the time factor actually makes the problem worse, because real chemistry goes in the wrong direction. And that's what we've seen even in the Milli-Urey experiment. So my point is, without a working naturalistic origin of life scenario, and I think there's been a ton of good lines of evidence brought up in this after show, particles to people evolution, it's dead in the water. So what does the evidence indicate? Well, life did not arise by physics and chemistry. I think that's clear. Without intelligence, that is. The intelligence needed to create life, even say the simplest life, is far greater than that of humans. We are still literally in awe over just how incredibly complex even one single cell is. And we're still, I say this all the time, we're still at the infancy in understanding the DNA language. And the more, like Sal was talking about, the more we discover about the DNA language, the more we actually realize just how implausible any origin of life scenario is. Even just getting around to trying to fully understand how even the simplest life forms work. One last point that just came to mind I want to say before I forget. I want to point out the fact that, let's say the information in a book, okay, it's not only based on the properties of the ink molecules on the paper, and I think a lot of people forget this fact, but it comes down to the way they are arranged into letters, words, sentences, paragraphs, and ultimately books, right? Is a random ink spill, I would ask the naturalistic evolutionist, is a random ink spill going to create the Lord of the Rings trilogy? Of course not. So my final point would be the fact that even if you got the chemistry right and figured out how to solve all of these major chicken and egg problems, you still have the information and the programming problem. So there's another chicken and egg problem. So that's all I got to say.
I would love to go when given the opportunity, but I know we're going kind of in a line, so I don't want to cut anyone off here.
Okay, so let me see here. We've got are James or Randolph still in the are they still in the stream, or have they passed out?
I'm here.
James,
no, I'm here.
James, do you have anything you want to insert before we go back to Gutsick?
Not really. I kind of did want to hear what Erika had to say about that. She knows way more than I will ever know about that. So, yeah.
All right. Now, Erika, before you go, Tony, do you have anything you want to add real quick before we go turn it back over and give Erika some time?
Yeah, I'd love to see a rebuttal video of some of the SFT abiogenesis vids. I'm in a couple of them. So, I mean, the origin of life field has been stagnant for decades. They're not making really any advancements. Everything they have shown is totally exaggerated. And as far as this RNA world, it's failing, it's highly unstable, and so on and so forth. It's really not going anywhere. So we're just going to hear a lot of storytelling at this point. Or maybe it happened, in another universe, on another planet.
True. Okay.
Maybe a magical deity.
Yeah, so they both be magic then. They're both unseen, untestable beliefs. Great.
Maybe.
Wow, okay.
Okay, Erika, go ahead if you want
Okay,
to.
cool. Okay, so while I was trying to keep up while Sal was talking, and obviously I can't read the papers in like 2 seconds, so I have not gotten the opportunity to really read past even just some of the abstract on some of kind of what I'm looking at. But I want to first contest that no, the origin of life research is certainly not stagnant. Looking just in 2 or 3 categories that Sal mentioned just in the 2020 year, I get dozens upon dozens upon dozens of results. Now, obviously, I haven't had the opportunity to really look at them, but their publishing journals are quite nice. PNAS, Nature, quite a bit from fairly reputable journals. So I think that saying it's dead on arrival, what Standing said, dead on arrival because there are problems with it, I don't think that's a workable statement. I mean, now I'm not going to really get into this very much because I personally don't think that it's kind of a fair thing to do. But I could sit here and for 30 minutes talk about the actual data and facts that do indeed, in my opinion and in the opinion of conventional science, preclude young Earth creationism at the very least. And when I say preclude, I do mean preclude. But I obviously we're talking about abiogenesis, and I'm fine with trying, attempting to defend that. But we can play those kinds of games, I suppose. I just don't think it's not something that I really want to do.
But Erika, these researchers aren't starting from scratch.
No. I'm totally with you. I don't. But again, in a prebiotic Earth, you're not really starting from scratch either. You're dealing with, what is essentially, intentionally or otherwise, a primed soup, as it were. But depending on where that is and the chemicals that would be involved.
Yeah, random chemicals.
Very quickly, Tony, let me continue on really fast. So very shortly, just on the looking into protein ancestry. Now, I do see this work by Eugene Koonin. I haven't actually obviously had the opportunity to read it, but I'm also finding papers published before it, like within the same 2 months, I should say, March 17th or March 27th in 2017, which discusses the structural reconstruction of protein ancestry and argues that simple folding can be essentially reconstructed all the way back to some of the very most ancient proteins and indeed create something of a tree. Now, I'm going to put all these in the chat after I'm done speaking so that everyone can access them. And hopefully, if they do contradict me, I'm sorry. Again, I haven't had the chance to read them. But kind of continuing on that, with regard to what was also spoken about earlier, I did have an opportunity to dig out some of the papers that I have on the evolution of communication, which is very key for the very basis of replication and reproduction, all from the past 3 years. So again, this is not if anything, this is one of the most booming fields of biology. Now, here's another paper that I have called Small Protein Folds at the Root of an Ancient Metabolic Network, which is from March 18th, 2020, Hagai Ranan. So while, Sal, I do entertain the idea because, again, I don't know enough about biochemistry to really contest it on the fly like this, but I don't think that I feel comfortable just agreeing with the idea that protein common ancestry is something that's being refuted. Let's play devil's advocate, though, and just say that you're right on that. Let's say that you are. Well, that doesn't really do anything necessarily against the concept of abiogenesis. I mean, what it does is it certainly complicates the situation. And when I say complicates, I don't necessarily means making it inherently more improbable. It's entirely dependent on the protein structure of the kind of prebiotic soup and the first cells that.
Erika, just to be nice, you are literally you're applying the premise that I put forth in my opening statement tonight of the debate, which is you don't want to look at all the different pieces of evidence from a macro view.
So, but here's the thing, though, John, right? Like, essentially, the first challenge of abiogenesis, right, is what kind of machinery do you need? Can you show that that machinery could exist in this prebiotic world? And as I mentioned in our debate many moons ago, this can be done in the case of lipids, RNA, and nucleic acids.
No, it can't. No, it can't, Erica.
Tony, again, I would love to have a conversation with you on another.
Yeah,
another
we actually have a whole video on that, and it actually doesn't work on many different levels. And what they are engineering in the lab does not work in a cell. So you're wrong.
I get what you're saying, but that's not really
Erica,
applicable.
do nucleotides have to be activated in order to bind?
Do nucleotides have to be activated?
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
You know that's
How?
a chemical process, right?
Okay. No, I understand that. What I'm saying is, you do realize that all of the experiments that are supposedly showing that this can happen are artificially activated?
Wait, guys, but you do realize that, like, saying that you have to make things work in a lab to show that they're possible is necessary first.
Okay, if it's recognized, no, Erica, the point I'm making is it's recognized from a physics and chemistry perspective. Would you agree or disagree that there are certain requirements that can be known from a physics and chemistry perspective that have to be in place in order for a chemical process to occur, right?
Yes, 100%. Can I say something on that?
So if we recognize fundamentals that are not explainable without either A, artificial modification by humans.
Well, I think that's a huge jump, though. Can I explain where I'm coming from?
It's not a huge jump. It's a recognized problem.
So can I explain where I'm coming from very briefly?
Erika, you have to get the desired molecules that are needed for life. And all you're basically saying is, well, all this stuff's going to be in the chemical soup. Come on, just believe us. No, it's stupidity.
I'm sorry. That's really not what I'm saying. But let me make my case for John very quickly. So when we were first trying to figure out how it was that lipids could actually form in this prebiotic Earth, right? Initially, they were found in the lab that it was found rather in a lab that they could self-assemble into spheres, because they're these hydrophilic pieces of cells. I'm sorry, it's getting kind of late where I am right now. But the problem with that was when they did it in a lab is they realized that these lipids destabilize in the presence of salt ions, right? So they did this in the lab and they were like, well, shoot, this doesn't work. What are we going to do? And it wasn't until they checked these metabolic hydrothermal vents that they figured out that these lipids were there and they were self-organizing and they weren't actually destabilizing. So what was the difference? Well, they took samples from around these hydrothermal vents and they realized that in the presence of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, they're heated and they essentially become more stabilized and they can then form these membranes. The point that I'm essentially trying to make here is that just because something doesn't work in a lab and requires human intervention to keep them to destabilize does not, just in this singular example, mean that in nature they cannot violate that rule. Because we were intervening to keep them stabilized in the lab. They were self-forming alone in the field, and then when we found that they were doing that, we figured out why. So I think that argument doesn't work, in my opinion.
Sal, do you want to? I know you've discussed that topic before. Do you want to address that one?
I was making all my responses in the chat, and I was providing references. I pointed out the paper by Travers and Abel, and also the book Godel, Escher, Bach, that explored the aspects of computer science that I was talking about. The one in Travers and Abel, let's see if I could find it. And I'm sorry that the language is technical, but that's the nature of what we're talking about. This is where I was saying, going back to Amy's question, could we ever figure it out? Even if we found new laws of physics, even if we found new laws of physics, this is the problem that Travers and Abel cited. Shannon uncertainty is a probability function, minus the log base 2 of p. When the probability of natural law events approaches 1.0, the Shannon uncertainty becomes minuscule, and they provide the formula. There is simply not enough Shannon uncertainty in cause-effect determinism and its reductionistic laws to retain instructions for life. This is a principle from information theory. Basically, if you have a chemical reaction that only goes one way, it's dead. It's just like salt crystals. What you need is a system that has many possibilities. That's what DNA provides. As you have a longer string of DNA, you have many more possibilities. But that also introduces the problem of improbability. So as a matter of principle, a replicating machine, such as one that does translation from blueprints, is going to be improbable as a matter of principle. And that's what really struck me. People are trying to solve this in terms of chemistry. It's going to fail as a matter of principle. So also, maybe to Amy's question, maybe on a personal level, why would we believe in Christianity? Well, if we've experienced miracles in our lives, that counts for something. When I nearly left the Christian faith, I was seeing these posts, these little tracts about Charles Duke, and then I finally met him and I read his book. When he returned from the moon, his marriage was in shambles, and he became a Christian in the process to try, because he's looking for cures. Shortly, sometime thereafter, he prayed for a blind girl, and she was healed within a matter of minutes. So yes, I get it that maybe a lot of us don't experience miracles like that. And in the view of the non-believers, these are just stories, or to them, Christianity is not credible. But for Charles Duke, the astronaut, and that little girl who got healed, Christ is all that matters to them. And I'm not going to take that away. And I find their account credible. It kept me in there until I was just that little spark kept me in the Christian faith when I was about to leave. And then I started studying the science behind this. And it was a grueling experience to learn. So regarding those lipid bilayers, the problem is not that it's stable. The problem is if there's not a mechanism for mitosis, the thing's dead on arrival. How's there going to be a mechanism for mitosis when the cell splits and tries to reproduce if there's no genome? That proves nothing. It's a dead end. It's a coffin. And Jack Shostak and the Origin of Life community of saying this is a big chunk, this is an advancement. And it's like, well, experiment happened, but it's amazing that someone of James Turr's caliber would just view it totally different. Same with Rob Stadler. So it's not in agreement what the meaning of the experiment even means.
So briefly, just super briefly, and then I know Standing wants to talk, and probably a bunch of other people too. The whole reason that I was bringing up the lipids in that situation was to make an example of the fact that just because something doesn't work in a lab doesn't mean inherently that it doesn't work, period. In fact, sometimes you miss the forest for the trees. In the case of the lipids, they didn't work when we were doing them just in the lab. It wasn't until an observation, or in addition to rather, an observation of hydrothermal vents that we saw that in the presence of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, they were capable of stabilizing. So the only point that I was trying to make with that was that sometimes the observation of something in action in nature is superior to what we can do in a lab. Sometimes. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, sometimes.
Accepted.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Standing, you want to jump back in?
Yeah, my bad. I was just talking in the chat. Yeah, let me get my train of thought back, I guess, over all the things that have been discussed. Very good after show. Lots of things, lots of good topics discussed. Great points all around. So I guess based on a couple of the things, let me see here, that was said mainly by Erika. Okay, so I've already discussed genetic degeneration. Actually, we discussed this, I think, at the beginning, as well as the numerous numerical simulations that have confirmed the fact that man is not getting any better, and the fact that what we are looking at in terms of the genetic evidence, right, the direct lines of evidence, is clear shelf lives on genomes. So given this evidence, my point would be that the very best conclusion is that an ape-like creature did not evolve into man through what? Through the slow accumulation of mutations, with, of course, natural selection acting upon this random variation. So I want to point out to the audience that, remember, it's the evolutionist that explains the origin of all DNA differences and DNA variety as the result of mutations. We have a different starting point when it comes to the origin of genetic diversity. But here's the thing, given what we now know about the deleterious effects of these mutations, fish are not going to evolve into fishermen scientifically. This is why it typically comes down to storyboards with the evolutionists, and, as James demonstrated earlier, historical reconstructions and storytelling through the fossil record. This is the place the evolutionist likes to hide out in, because it's where you can get the most assumptions, inferences, imagination, essentially. And then my last response to everything that has been said is simply that the direct lines of evidence, for example, found in genetics, demonstrates that what we are looking at is a young genome. And just like how Erika pointed out that she could spend 30 minutes to an hour going over all the numbers of lines of evidence that debunks a young Earth, apparently, I could spend 30 days going over the massive amounts of evidence confirming a young Earth. But most importantly, this does not take away from the massive amounts of evidence that confirms independent origins and refutes universal common ancestry, not to mention the chemistry that we've been discussing that makes any origin of life scenario essentially impossible. And that's it.
I appreciate that standing. And Erika, I gave you a wrench if you want to post the links to those papers you were
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
talking about.
Just trying to get in the queue when you have a chance.
Okay, Amy, you can come back in if we don't go into like full scale. What I just heard wasn't actually said. Go ahead.
Every time I say that, you say that.
I keep letting you in, and then you keep literally acting like whatever the previous person said that you're supposedly addressing didn't actually occur. You didn't do this at the beginning of the when you came in. You've been doing it for like the last 3 rounds. Go ahead.
Okay. So Sal, you were talking about miracles, and you said that you have seen miracles occur. Do you define the miracle as a once-off? Because by definition, that would mean that it's not empirical and it can't be tested. And you're a man of science. I mean, don't you think you should be able to test it and prove it? You're muted.
I'm sorry. That's a very good question, and I wanted to say it's very nice meeting you, Amy.
It was very nice meeting you, and you're a sweet guy. I'm sorry if my questions and all this, I don't want to come off.
Oh, you said I'm a... Oh, don't say that.
Oh, or curse. Should I not curse? I don't know.
Oh, I no. There's a thing, you know, I'm trying not to be a nice guy, but anyway. What you asked, it can't be empirically verified independently. It can only be something that I experienced. I saw a vision when I was 12, 13 years old, and it scared me. And then there were some things that were happening that I'm kind of ashamed of, because I got involved in astrology and some of what we call New Age now, but it's the occult and psychic phenomenon. I was able to look at bugs and just use telekinetic ability. And in the book of Acts, it says that probably comes from a demonic spirit. After I became a Christian, all that ended and a lot of the fear left. So you could say that was a hallucination, and I would not be insulted. I mean, I've wondered, okay, was I just imagining this? So I totally respect that. But at some point, because of those experiences, I began to be at least a little more open to looking at the problem of the origin of life and Noah's flood from a scientific standpoint. I'm more willing to postulate miracles. And so for the one with Charles Duke, who's way more respected than I am or ever will be, he was a national hero in the 70s for having walked on the moon. He would have no reason to fabricate stories that he became a Christian and was healing a little girl in the name of Jesus. I mean, that's something a televangelist might do, trying to draw funds, but not someone like Charles Duke. So I think it's a very noble thing that you would, for anyone seeking the Christian faith, that they would want more evidence. I don't fault anyone for wanting to see works of Jesus in their life powerfully, each and every moment of their life, but God has chosen to be hidden. So that aspect of my personal thing, personal experiences, I'm not going to try to represent that as evidence for anyone else. It's only evidence for me, and not for anyone else. I'm not going to expect them to believe that it's credible. I'm not insulted if they think it was just some hallucination. That's fine. I never did drugs. But as I pointed out, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, I asked someone point blank on Matt Dillahunty's show, Tracy Harris. I said, okay, let's say you're that blind girl that was healed in the name of Jesus. I told her, I said, if that happened to me, I'd follow Jesus the rest of my life. I'd be curious what you would do. She said, no, she wouldn't. She'd say, well, I'd try to figure out a naturalistic explanation and try to get everyone healed. And I'm like, okay, that's where you are. Or she would ask the question, why doesn't Jesus heal everyone? I said, that's also a legitimate question. Each person has their threshold of what they would do in that circumstance. But if Jesus did that for me, I'd follow him the rest of my life. I would not be trying to say, hey, I'm going to try to figure out a naturalistic explanation. So, I mean, I understand where Tracy's coming from, because it seems kind of cruel that Jesus wouldn't heal every blind girl out there or heal every childhood cancer. So I totally get that. And having, as I shared some really personal things that happened with my aunt, real tragedies in her life, I can get that. So what it boils down to me is, what would I be willing to wager my soul on? I'm not going to wager it on abiogenesis or multiverses. And atheism is not, I mean, I respect the skepticism of atheists, but I ask, well, where's the meaning in life from this? And why does it give me a reason for living? Amy, you're muted if you're saying something.
I was just basically gesturing. It's all around. We make our meeting. As you do what our body, as long as you eat and you get rid of it and sometimes have sex. Those are our three things. Our body just lets us do what we want. We can find meaning. We can help people if we want. We can spend our whole lives just giving to charity.
And I will say this. I found the story of Andrew Carnegie. He was a pretty ruthless businessman, but toward the end of his life, he gave all of his money to charity. But he said he would never serve Jesus Christ. And there are people like that. So that's not for me. And the reasons that I cited is I think Noah's flood is real. The more I've studied it, and that's one of the reasons I went to study physics in graduate school, was to solve problems with radiometric dating and issues related to the creationist model. And to the extent that I said, even if there's a 1% chance that Noah's flood's real, that's enough to make me fear and tremble that the Christian God is real. But anyway, thank you for hearing me out. Thank you for asking me the questions.
Yeah, and thank you, Brandon.
All right, so I have now transitioned into a more comfortable position in which I am now reposed, as I had to move my microphone. Is the audio still coming through okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so I know Standing has to go. He's got to leave soon and convince his wife that he has not actually been on YouTube until 3:21 a.m. his time. Standing, before you have to head out, anything you want to bring into the stream before you go pretend like you've been in bed this whole time?
Yeah, as long as I hit the sack 5 minutes before she comes home and pretend I'm asleep, I should be good. No, I think I said everything that I felt the need to. Good points there from Sal. And yeah, no, it's been a good discussion. It's been a good after show. I am going to head out, even though I could probably still spend another couple hours here, but I'll be listening from the sidelines. So thank you, everybody. It's been a good talk. Time has flown by. Erika, thanks for sticking this out. It's been fun.